Well, good morning. I'm Jason Griffin. It is a real privilege to welcome you all to this session on the 2020 voting experience, thinking about opportunities for reform. As I think most of you know, the coins of our realm are evidence, timeliness, and relevance, and we could not be more pleased to have the opportunity to host this discussion among so many people whose incredibly hard work over the last several weeks and years has been essential to our nation's accomplishment yesterday evening of certifying the results of the 2020 election. You know, we work on a whole lot of issues. We believe in the fierce urgency of pragmatism, and whether it's energy policy or health policy or immigration or economic policy, we understand that the firmament beneath all of that is having a government that has the legitimacy to lead and to compromise. And so for us, elections is a whole of organization project, and we are really ready to go. There is no rest for the weary, as I think many of you know, because some of the most important issues in our elections going forward have to be debated and reconciled in the next several months. And there are two very obvious questions that I think we're going to focus on during the next few hours. You know, the first is that the pandemic has driven changes that have fundamentally changed the conduct, the participation, and the perception of elections in our country, and unfortunately amplified a number of the kind of partisan trenches around access and security and legitimacy. And we need to figure out as a nation which aspects of these changes have been productive and can be kind of encoded into the election ecosystem going forwards, and where there are frailties that need to be addressed. And so dynamic change creates some tremendous opportunity and requires most of you on the phone to continue to have a lot of sleepless weekends. Secondly, I think it is unfortunately fair to expect that people who lose elections in this country are going to begin to more actively question the legitimacy of the process. And this simply means that we have to be even better. We simply cannot have opportunities, frailties, limitations that can amplify the weaponization of illegitimacy. And so I think the conversation that we've had for years with many of you is what can be done to make the administration of elections secure, funded, competent, and trusted. And so we'll be talking about that a whole bunch. So as we think about going forwards, this is kind of the foundation. I just, can't thank you folks enough, not for joining us today, but for everything so many of you have done over the last several weeks. Pleasure to turn this over now to my friend and colleague, Matt Weil, who has also been on a juggernaut of work, and ask you, Matt, to get us started. So thank you all.
Thank you, Jason. Today will be a rapid fire day of panels covering voting by mail, in-person voting, the funding of elections, election litigation, voter turnout and preferences, election cybersecurity, and more. Any one of these panels could fill several hours of discussion. So think of today as BPC's launch into the next 2 years of policy research, development, and recommendations. You can be sure that 2021 will see a lot more coming from BPC elections. I promise to minimize my time on the screen today so you can hear from our rockstar panelists, but I want to thank the Democracy Fund, the Hewlett Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the Healthy Elections Project for partnering with us on this event. I also want to preemptively thank all the panelists you will hear today. In this never-ending election year, I know you are all exhausted. I appreciate how you moved mountains to make today work within our tight schedule. And finally, on behalf of myself and the Bipartisan Policy Center, I want to thank all of the election administrators, poll workers, and tens of thousands of other Americans who worked tirelessly to make elections 2020 a reality. Many of you were subjected to absolutely impossible conditions and more than a little rudeness. We are all in your debt. With that, we hit today running with our first panel focused on what we know about the voters in 2020, what we need to know, and what it all means for voter reforms going forward. Rob Griffin is the research director of the Democracy Fund's Voter Study Group. He has a whole bunch of other affiliations and accomplishments, and you can read his full bio and the bio of all our panelists and moderators throughout today on BPC's website. Rob, the panel is yours.
Thanks, Matt. And again, thanks everyone for joining us. This very first panel, we're going to be discussing voter behavior in the 2020 election, voter attitudes, and especially how voters actually cast their ballot and how they turned out this year. So again, as Matt said, we have a pretty tight schedule today. We have a rather spectacular first panel. I am going to keep their bios very short, but they are much shorter than they actually deserve. So leading us off will be a presentation from Charles Stewart. Charles is a professor of political science at MIT. He is also the founding director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. He'll be presenting results from the survey of the performance of American elections. We're also going to be joined by Kei Kawashima Ginsburg, who is the director of CIRCLE. That's the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Also joining us will be Emily Eakins, research fellow and director of polling at the Cato Institute. And last but certainly not least, Bernard Fraga, who's professor of political science at Emory University. So without much ado, Charles, I will lead us through a presentation and we'll be followed up with some comments by our other panelists. And Charles, you are muted.
This is not going to bode well for the day, or I hope it's a one-off. And I apologize for starting us off like this. And you're about to see that I'm also going to start off in the middle of the presentation, maybe or maybe not. So, am I showing the presentation, Rob?
You are. If you could just put it in presentation mode, that'd be great.
Oh yeah. Sorry about that, man. Let's do this again. Okay. We're going to get going here. We're going to hit that. Are we in presentation mode?
Yes, yeah, no, it's in presentation mode now. If you just want to rewind to the start.
Right. Oh, geez. Really have to apologize. I thought I was exactly where I needed to be. And we'll start this again. And you would think that after an entire semester of teaching online, I would have mastered this, but how's that?
Yep, all good.
Okay, good. So I've already used all my time, I guess. So it was nice talking to you all. It's great being here. And again, thanks, Rob, and thanks to Matt and all the crew at Bipartisan Policy Center for organizing this. This is going to be a great day. And just to jump into things, because I know we don't have much time, we're putting in 2 days of presentations into one day today. So I just want to start things off by talking about the results of the survey of the performance of American elections, which I've been running since the election of 2008, which focuses on the experience of voters as they cast ballots either in person or by mail. In past years, we've interviewed at least 10,000 people immediately after the election. This year, we interviewed close to around 18,000 people, as we interviewed 200 respondents from 40 states in the District of Columbia, plus 1,000 respondents from 10 of the battleground states. The survey was conducted by YouGov, and it was supported in part by the generosity of the Democracy Fund. This survey really focuses on the experience of voters, as the title suggests. And there's really 5 takeaways from the survey. The first is the documenting what many of us intuited, which is half of Americans voted by mail in this election, a quarter in person on election day, another quarter during the early voting period. Qualitatively for voters, when they voted by both mail and in person, it was very similar to the past, which is to say it was a positive experience overall. And so consistent with what we've been saying about this being an incredibly well-run election. Confidence in the vote count overall was as high as it's been in the past, but this overall top line number masks the type of partisan divisions that we've come to expect, unfortunately, in this area of election administration. And similarly, attitudes about fraud, while they've been, they were kind of constant compared to the past, we see much greater division between the parties. And then finally, one final partisan division, support for mail voting has in fact increased, although partisan divisions are there as well. So let's talk very quickly about the transition to mail voting. This graph just shows the timeline up to 2016 over the last 20 years of the percentage of people who've been voting on election day by mail and been voting early. And we can see that there's been a gradual decline of election day voting and gradual increase in voting, early voting by mail and in person. Well, dramatic change in 2020, not surprisingly. Nearly half of Americans voting by mail and roughly a quarter, as I said before, voting both on election day and voting in person. Of course, there's not homogeneity across the country. Different states vote in different ways. And so if we look at state by state over the same period, we'll see the diversity of that change. This is Tammy Patrick's favorite graph, and I'll just show very quickly for those of you who've not seen this before. This triangle plot, if you're states at the top, you're all voting by mail. Down in the left-hand corner, everybody's voting. I'm sorry, at the top, everybody's voting on election day. Bottom left, everybody's voting by mail. Bottom right, everybody's voting early. 1996, in virtually every state, all the voters were voting by mail. There were some exceptions. For instance, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington were beginning to go in their mail directions. Tennessee and Texas were beginning to go in their early voting directions. And if we go down year by year, we get the snow globe effect till we get to 2016, the states falling from the top down below, mostly down to the left, voting by mail. 2020, this is where we are, with a general shift down to the left, as most states increased voting by mail. In fact, every state by the survey respondents, at least, had less voting on election day and at least some more voting by mail everywhere. Of course, another way of looking at this is just regionally. In 2016, we see that voting by mail was mainly a West Coast phenomenon, or a Western US phenomenon. In 2020, while the West continued its growth in voting by mail expanded toward basically the Midwest and along the Eastern Seaboard. Divisions by party were remarked on during the run-up to the election. Prior to 2020, there had been a slight preference among Democrats for voting by mail. This was largely, by the way, due to the fact that the vote by mail states themselves tend to trend more democratically. But as we see in 2020, the fraction of Democrats reporting that they voted by mail is roughly 60% of Democrats, 30% of Republicans. So a 2-to-1 margin of Democrats over Republicans in voting by mail. Qualitatively, we ask voters when they voted by mail their experience in various parts of the process. And uniformly, similar to the past, it's been very high, very high satisfaction. That is to say, almost nobody experienced problems getting their mail, nor with marking the ballot. The instructions by and far were easy to follow, and voters by mail were very confident or somewhat confident that their vote was counted as intended. Now, one of the issues was how are voters going to return their ballots? Issues of drop boxes became salient during the run-up. And we see here that when we ask people how they returned their ballots, in 2016, 2/3 mailed them back. In 2020, roughly only half mailed back their ballots. With the rise with drop boxes, returning to election offices, and returning to polling places, all becoming much more prevalent. We asked people who had voted by mail if they planned to vote again, if they had done it before regularly, if they plan to do it in the future. And we see here that 60% of people who voted by mail said they're very likely to do so in the future. 21% said they're somewhat likely. Democrats are more likely, not surprisingly, to say that they are very likely to vote by mail in the future, but still a significant number of Republicans say they're likely to vote by mail in the future. I take this to mean that we're likely to see large amounts of voting by mail in the future. The fact that these numbers are not 100% suggests that there may be some rollback of voting by mail in the years to come. And so nonetheless, a number of voters have taken a bite of the apple, and they're likely to like it. Looking at in-person voting, there's a great deal of continuity there. The issue here, of course, was how to deal with the fact that there was going to be challenges in maintaining polling places, recruiting poll workers, and in bringing in the equipment, the PPE, and other things necessary to ensure social distancing and healthy voting. When we asked voters here qualitatively their experience voting in person, Similarly, with voting by mail, it was positive. Voters reported very few problems with registration when they checked in. Almost nobody encountered problems with equipment. The vast majority said that the polling place that they voted in was very well run. And they rated the performance of the poll workers as excellent or good, very similar to the past. Confidence that their vote was counted as cast was down compared to the past, but I attribute this to the fact that Republicans were more likely to vote in person, and Republicans, as we'll see it just in a second, had lower confidence this year. Similarly, earlier when we saw that mail voters were more confident in their vote than in the past years, this was due to Democrats being disproportionately voting by mail. Okay. Where did people vote? Okay, so there were challenges to maintaining the old voting sites of churches and schools, first responder facilities such as firehouses, and private businesses such as casinos. So where did people vote this time around? Well, when we asked them, they reported that their tendency to vote in schools dropped significantly, as did the tendency to vote in churches. Schools and churches used to be number 1 and 2 in terms of where people voted. In 2020, they were 3 and 4. They were replaced by community centers and other government buildings, such as courthouses and large government operations, more modern buildings than before. Libraries also stepped up and offered their facilities to vote. There's been some interest in arena voting, by the way. In this survey, less than 1% of voters voted in an arena, a sports facility. In the counties that actually had the facilities, though, roughly 3% of voters used those facilities. Okay. Voters felt that the layout of their polling place was protective against COVID-19. 86% saw poll workers with masks, 74% saw hand sanitizers, and the rest. So they saw a number of things in the polling places to make things safe. Hand sanitizers and voting booths being cleaned were associated most strongly with people believing that the facility was safe. Lines. Well, with fewer facilities, taking longer to deal with people, to service people, it's not surprising that wait times went up significantly in 2020 compared to 2016. The fraction of people waiting more than 30 minutes to vote roughly doubled compared to 2016. However, I would point out that wait times were roughly on a par with what they were in 2008. So they were up significantly, but they were not up to such a degree that we would have been surprised at these wait times if we had encountered them in 2008. Confidence in elections. Here, as I mentioned previously, when we ask about confidence, overall, the top lines were similar to the past, where the fraction of people saying that they were confident that their vote was counted as cast was as high as it's been as in the past. If we ask about votes counted in the state, they were also about the same levels of confidence. And nationwide, this was a little bit different in the sense that the people who said that they were very confident went up, and people who were very not confident went up as well. So here we see most strongly the bifurcation of partisan attitudes about confidence. It's really in the nationwide arena. And we break things down by party in this nationwide vote. We see the splitting of the two parties dramatically, and to degrees that I haven't seen in looking at this item since the 2000 election. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of getting to the end. Issues of fraud. We've been asking for now a dozen years about how prevalent people think fraud is. And again, the top lines are very constant with the past in terms of the fraction of people who believe that absentee ballot fraud is common, non-citizens voting is common, people impersonating others when they vote, voting more than once, changing outcomes, or stealing and tampering with ballots. All these have been relatively constant. However, again, when we break this down by party, Republicans have tended to be a bit more likely to believe that fraud is common, or to disagree that it never or almost never happens. Big, wide gap in 2020, much greater than what we've seen in the past. And finally, and I'll end on this, talking about reform, we ask about a number of items concerning reform, everything from voting on the internet to selecting partisan officials on a nonpartisan basis. These numbers really didn't change very much in 2020. I will note, however, that the items that changed the most were embracing the idea of having to show a photo ID to vote, and this idea of running all votes by mail. And in particular, support for photo ID went up, both among Democrats and Republicans compared to the past. Support for mail balloting went up overall, but as we see in the next graph, this is primarily because it's gone up strongly among Democrats. Republicans, by the way, have never been in favor of all voting by mail. And so that, attacks on voting by mail during the pre-election period were already kind of playing to a fertile ground, as it were. But Democrats are really interested in the reform. One of the things I find interesting, the fact that we can drill down into states, we can see how this is playing out in states. And one of the things I noticed is that in the 3 traditional vote by mail states, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, which has been the one place where Republicans have not been overwhelmingly against vote by mail to this point, support for vote by mail, even in those states, has declined rapidly, which is no doubt going to affect things in politics in those states for years to come. So to finish up, this has been obviously the most administratively challenging election in a generation, if not in forever. And I think everybody on this at this event understands that. We've seen already many people saying this was the most secure election in history and one of the best run elections in history, especially when we add degrees of difficulty. But we can also now say that from the perspective of the grassroots, from the voters casting their ballots, that their experience was a good one. And I think that this can add to the story of this election that administratively it was very well run. Partisan divisions, though, are very clear at the mass level, replicating what we're seeing at the elite level. And this, no doubt, is going to have significant consequences in the months and years ahead as we plan the next steps in election administration in the United States. So thanks very much for your time, and back to you, Rob.
And Charles, if you just want to take that, yep, there you go. Thanks so much, Charles. Again, really, really fascinating, and I think a really coherent presentation in the short time you were given. I'll follow up with just one quick question for you. And you touched upon it just briefly, I think, during the presentation, but, crystal ball, if you're talking to political parties, if you're talking to state and local election officials, what can you maybe guess about the appetites of voters in the United States for different types of vote methodologies, right? Is 2020 just going to be an odd duck, right? Do we walk away and this is just a kind of a strange year and it doesn't really tell us much about the future? Or do we see signs that really maybe this is a pivot point in terms of some people's behavior?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, on the other hand, right? I mean, we see that in the rising partisan divisions, but I think we also see right, and so that's going to, I think, make it very difficult in many states to kind of move in having doing major changes, especially in states that are closely divided by partisanship. On the other hand, it's a non-trivial number, for instance, of Republican voters like voting by mail, and so I mean, it seems to me that actually the vote by mail issue may very well be very different from, say, the voter ID issue. At the mass level, in the sense that there's kind of a lot of people in the parties who are going to go against hype, especially on the Republican side. And so, I mean, I think that a well-controlled mail ballot set of reforms may, surprisingly, at the end of the day, maybe not, doesn't seem that way right now, but maybe in a couple of months may be doable in many, many states.
And with that, we're going to turn, I think, to our other panelists. And just to tell for the crowd too, we're going to shift gears just slightly. to talk. Obviously, this was a lot about voters' experiences and some sort of, voter modes. We're also going to talk here about turnout and how people's behavior changed this time around. So I'm actually going to start off with Emily Eakins. And, a big thing for me, as someone, as it is for many of us on this panel, whose job is at some level kind of helping to narrativize what has happened, right? To tell us about the nature of the election and communicate that to folks. 2020 is kind of tough because one of the biggest tools that we have to do that has been surveys, right? So we have these public opinion surveys like the presentation we just saw and other data sets that we're going to rely on. But we know that there are potentially some underlying issues going on with them, and we don't necessarily understand the contours of that problem yet. So Emily, I'm just curious if you can talk about maybe some of the issues that we saw in polling this election cycle, maybe some of the sources that people have started to identify as potential areas to investigate if we're looking for problems, and maybe just the types of caveats we should be putting as we try to narrativize and understand what happened this election cycle. And you were muted, Emily.
Yes. I think that after 2016, people felt like the polls had misled them, even though they weren't that far off the actual result. Hillary Clinton did get more votes than Donald Trump in 2016 and was within the margin of error. But as people who follow polls closely can attest that when there were errors, to the extent that there were errors, they were all errors in the same direction. Meaning that it was underestimating Trump's support in 2016. I think a lot of people thought that that might have been an anomalous election, that, just he had inspired a lot of new voters to show up that we just hadn't anticipated in our likely voter models. And so kind of the postmortems after 2016, a list of recommendations had come out and pollsters had adjusted their samples to deal with that, we thought adequately enough. So this time we thought, are the polls underestimating Trump's support? Probably not, because we addressed the things that we thought needed to be done after 2016. In particular, in Midwestern states, kind of turning up the dial on non-college white voters who disproportionately support Trump. Well, then we have 2020. And while, again, the polls got the winner correct, I think we can all agree that they misled us again. And I think a lot about Brexit as well and how the polls misled there too. And I'm starting to think that I think a lot of pollsters are starting to come to the realization that perhaps there's a trend. And it's less about idiosyncratic factors, but something a little bit more systemic. And so while there always will be idiosyncratic factors, I think a lot of pollsters have pointed out the effect of the pandemic and how that's affected who's available and eager to take surveys. Certainly that's very plausible that we see that Democrats were a lot more willing to take surveys since they were more likely to be social distancing and quarantining at home than Republicans. But I think that there's one area where a lot of pollsters are starting to pay more attention to, and that's the idea of partisan non-response. And what that means is that it seems like certain types of voters that support not just Trump, but also Republicans in general, were less likely to take surveys. Now, an original conception of this was the idea of a, quote, shy Trump voter. And what that implies is that someone secretly supports Trump, but they don't tell you that on the survey. They lie and say, oh, I'm not going to vote, or I'm going to vote for the other candidate. But there's less evidence for that because we also saw Republicans down the ballot being underestimated. Senator Susan Collins in Maine is a great example of this. Were there any polls that showed her ahead in the month or two prior? So, were people shy Susan Collins voters? It seems less likely, and a more plausible explanation seems to be something in the area of partisan non-response. And in particular, it seems like certain segments of Republicans are not responding to surveys because, as you know, surveys usually include weights that ensure that the partisan composition of a poll is representative of what we believe the actual electorate looks like. And so these polls had enough, enough Republicans in them, but it seemed for some reason, it was undercounting Trump's support. And so a lot of people are thinking about, in particular, low social trust Republican and Trump voters for some reason are less likely to be participating in surveys. And so as pollsters, we have to think a lot about, how we interpret our results and how to address that. And then we also want to be thinking about, well, why is this happening? Because it's not the case that every election the polls are misleading us. 2018 was pretty decent. So why is it when Trump's at the top of the ticket, or, you could say Brexit had some similarities in terms of the salient issues, immigration being one of them, Trump also largely being about immigration in the minds of many voters. Why are some people with low social trust perhaps just opting out of surveys and saying, no thanks? And some of the evidence we have for this is if you look at again, we're kind of relying on surveys here, so it's not the best, but we have seen a precipitous decline, particularly among Republicans, in support for major societal institutions like the media. Support has gone way down. Support for universities and colleges, support's gone way down. And it's not just during the Trump era. This predates Trump, but Trump has specifically repeatedly attacked the media, calling the media the enemy of the people, specifically calling out polls, saying they're fake. And so all these things, the decline of confidence in societal institutions, which polls are, in the minds of voters and respondents, they probably connect those two. So you have the decline of confidence in societal institutions, and then Trump, constantly berating and saying, these are corrupt institutions, don't trust them. You think that maybe that's had some effect on people's willingness to take surveys.
And Emily, just one quick follow-up question. I think another piece of this too is how we can think about the different types of information that are coming from surveys. So one of them is horse race stuff, right? So who's up and who's down in a horse race. And another one is sometimes what's called issue polling, right? Which is how do people feel about certain types of things? Do they have confidence in institutions? Do they support certain types of laws or not? Just your thoughts there. Is it a one-to-one translation? That is to say, if we're seeing certain 4 points of error in the polls over here, is it 4 points of error in issue polling? Is it better? Is it worse?
So I think that if it's partisan non-response, that is kind of the common problem between these different elections where the polls have misled, then we would expect it to be somewhat across the board, because like I mentioned, it wasn't just Trump that the polls underestimated. It was also Republicans down ballot. And that's because we can validate that. We actually know how many votes Susan Collins got and can compare that. Whereas if we ask people, what issues are your priority, it's harder to actually validate that. And so based on that evidence, I would expect it to be a little bit more across the board as opposed to just one, the horse race questions being off.
Thanks so much, Emily. So, keeping all of those survey-based problems in mind, I think one of the other toolkits that we have is things like the voter file, right? So these are a piece of data that are administered by the states, and depending on the question that we're asking, and sometimes we're asking questions about the composition of the electorate and people's turnout rates, they can be a pretty good source of information. So Bernard, I kind of want to turn to you. You've done some analysis of the voter file in Georgia and that election there, and I'm just interested if you could talk us through what's unique about Georgia from a data perspective and the analysis that you did, right? How might it avoid some of these problems with polling that we talked about in terms of telling us stories and helping to narrativize the election? And then also, Georgia is one state among 50, but how much might we be able to extrapolate from it?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Rob, and thank you, Matt, and the rest of the BPC team for inviting me to be on the panel. If we look at the overall national picture, we have, all of the election results are now certified, and we have some estimates of the size of the U.S. population and composition of the population. One thing we know that, and this builds on Charles's presentation, is that turnout was up quite a bit in 2020 compared to 2016. About 2/3 of Americans who were eligible to vote turned out to vote this year versus only 60% in 2016. And if we look at Georgia, one of the first states that has all the vote history data coded at the individual level, has tremendous information about the race and ethnicity of people because you report that information when you register to vote in Georgia, unlike most states. The trends there in terms of overall look kind of similar to the rest of the country. About 68% turned out to vote of those eligible versus 60% in 2016. But again, because of that detailed voter file data, again, official data reported by the states, not self-reported information from voters about whether they turned out or not, we look at the racial ethnic breakdown in terms of the rate of voter turnout, we see some patterns that I think are indicative of what happened in this election in the context of a pandemic and massive voter interest and mobilization. About 70% of non-Hispanic white voters in Georgia who could have voted turned out to vote. For African Americans, that number drops down to 58%. Again, despite massive mobilization campaigns, but in the context of a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted African Americans, turnout was about 58%. If we look at the Hispanic population, a growing part of Georgia's population, diversifying, only 43% of Latinos who are citizens, adults of voting age, turned out to vote. For Asian Americans, turnout was up quite a bit relative to 2016. About 62% of Asian Americans, again, a growing but still relatively small share of Georgia's population, turned out to vote. So if we look overall, the Georgia trends in terms of race and ethnicity might not tell us so much about national trends because of the tremendous voter mobilization we see in this state. I'm speaking to you from Georgia, from Atlanta, right, where we're all gearing up for the runoff. We see disproportionate increases in turnout for some groups and a continuation of some dramatic disparities in voter turnout by race and ethnicity. So I think this also tells us that there might be a limit to the extent to which mobilization and interest can remedy these disparities in voter turnout. Now, in Georgia, because again, they have excellent data on race in the voter file, campaigns can micro-target much more effectively than in most other states. So I know that right now, as people are doing their canvassing work for the runoff, some organizations are contacting every single Latino voter or every single potential Asian American voter in the state of Georgia. But we still don't see every single person turning out to vote. Some people are going to be resistant to those mobilization tactics, even when they're micro-targeted. So it says there might be kind of a ceiling in voter turnout. And I think when we consider the fact that even this historic election, even with the ease of voting by mail, and the fact that, as Charles Stewart reported, voters indicated that they had a very good experience voting, they knew what they needed to vote, right? Massive shifts in vote method, still, 1/3 of Americans did not turn out to vote, despite the fact that they could have. So I think Georgia indicates, again, some continuing disparities that we want to think about going forward. How can those be remedied? But also the fact that in a historic election, turnout was exceptionally high.
And Bernard, even just one follow-up question, because you touched on something that I think is kind of a sleeper story of the whole election, which is this really radical increase in Asian American turnout. And again, Georgia is one state. We don't know that it's indicative of what's happening elsewhere. But is there any sense, since you're on the ground in Georgia, why might we have seen this election? What was it about this election that seemed to have activated this portion of the electorate that has historically just had a turnout rate that's been lower than that of other racial and ethnic groups?
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. If we look at the historical record, one thing that we see, again, with voter file data where it's available and imputing that information where it's not, using modeled, statistical models. We know that Latino and Asian American turnout always lags African American white turnout nationally and in nearly every state. It looks like Georgia this year might be an exception where Asian American turnout actually exceeded African American turnout. And that's not a trend we saw historically, again, using voter file data from Georgia. Looks like Asian American turnout was up 20 percentage points from what it was in 2016. I think that's a testament to the work on the ground that organizations are doing. Also, the availability of the data that facilitates mobilization, because again, an organization that's getting the resources necessary to do the work can actually can knock on the doors, text or phone call every single Asian American voter in Georgia. The fact that Asian Americans are in some ways more of a swing electorate than what we see for African Americans or even for Latinos, at least historically, and this year that was the case as well, more divided in their partisan preferences, although leaning Democratic. But again, I think it really points to the fact that even with all of those efforts, we still saw, again, more than a third of Asian Americans who could have voted not turn out to vote in Georgia, a trend that we're likely to see in other states as well.
And thanks so much, Bernard. And Kay, I think we're going to kind of finish up our session with you. And obviously, you have a long history of working on issues relating to young voters. And one of the trends that we're seeing from some of the states where we do have that, again, complete voter file so far, what we're seeing is an increase in the share of the number of voters who are 18 to 29. So I'll just read off a couple of quick stats. But Georgia, the share of voters that were 18 to 29 was up by 3 points. Colorado was up by 1 point. Nevada up by 3, Oregon up by 1, Washington up by 2, Montana up by 3. Again, these are sort of a random bit of number of states, just because these are the states that happen to be the ones that are have the data in so far. I think this is, for those who work on this issue, kind of astounding, because the story has sort of forever and a day been, maybe this will be the election where we actually see this share of the electorate go up in a substantial way. I wonder if you could just talk us through, I think, maybe what was different about this election, why we saw turnout not just go up, but also kind of go up relative to other age groups, and what this might portend for the future about 18 to 29-year-olds, young voters. Again, is 2020 just an odd year, or might we see shadows of this in the next couple of elections?
Thanks for those questions. So young people, as we've been watching them for 20 years, have had ebbs and flows in turnout, with a relative high of 2008 to kind of relative low of 2012 and 16, and now 20, which is significant because in the context of higher turnout, overall historic one, youth share is larger. That means, again, like 2018, young people increased their turnout relative to their past relatively similar election, like midterm in 2018 and 2020 to 2016 election, by a lot. We don't yet know exactly what the national turnout estimate's going to be, but what we have from midterm shows that they've pretty much doubled turnout. That's not going to happen this year, but we can expect a pretty high increase, and that pattern's likely to stay. I think one of the, or a few trends that's been driving youth turnout, for one, is the fact that there were a lot more young people participating in midterm election in 2018. Coming into the 2020 election, we had a lot more young people who had experience of voting as a youth electorate. So that was one thing that made it much easier for them to say update their registration rather than completing a whole new registration form. There were, of course, a large amount of complications. Like, for example, college students really had to figure out where to vote, how to vote, exactly where they can receive their ballots and where they're eligible. So there was a lot more challenges that they faced as young voters. And then, of course, on the groundwork that happens for youth voting is really important in normal election cycle, where young people see, other young people canvassing everywhere on campus, in their community, coming to their neighborhoods and concerts and talking to them about the importance of their vote. None of those happened in person this year. So we were seeing both a great amount of hope and optimism from 2008 and a huge amount of concerns. For example, only 24% of young people in our survey reported having ever voted by mail, and having a lot of confusion about online registration as well. So those things really sort of concern us. And going back to Bernard's point about only, maybe 2/3, maybe with young people, about half of young people are still able to vote. And those barriers likely still affected historically marginalized populations more than more affluent and more privileged populations. So that's something that we're going to watch out for. Georgia's numbers really kind of resonate with what we would have guessed, given the impact of pandemic that's disproportionate. So we'll see what happens.
All right, and we do have a hard stop there. I want to go ahead and thank all the panelists, and thank you, Kay, for your last response. We're going to just go into a brief intermission, and we will be back in 1 minute. Again, thank you for all our panelists.